Hello, and welcome back to another high-speed chase edition of Zilog and Moto. I'm your host Dave, and this is the place for all things 8 and 16-bit Sega, namely the Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, which is an important distinction on today's video, Sega CD and 32X. And by all things, I really just mean game reviews. And specifically those games that are in English, because let's face it, the chances of me learning Japanese at this point are about as likely as me ever fitting into a medium t-shirt again. It's not happening. All silliness aside, if you're interested in a channel where one guy goes on that crazy journey through 1,275 games that were almost 10% of the way through, so close, then I recommend you subscribe, as I usually release one video a week, but sometimes there's bonus content, and it's not always on a set schedule. So you might get a video on a Monday or a Friday, who knows? Also, if you enjoy the videos, please comment and like them as well. I do enjoy hearing about other people's experiences with these games, and it's always interesting to see what someone halfway across the world thought about the same game. The worldwide aspect of this channel is something that's important to today's video, as today's game is a Mega Drive game and not a Genesis game, as it was never released in the United States. At least not on a Sega-based platform anyway. I've covered plenty of PAL releases for the Master System, seeing as how that's half that console's library, but so far this is only the third Mega Drive exclusive I've looked at, after reviewing EA Hockey in episode 18 and Rise of the Robots in episode 61. Probably need to start working more of these into the schedule, but to be honest, I didn't have a whole lot of them to review until recently, which is where today's game comes in. You see, about 2 months ago I recognized that the collection was lagging behind a bit in the Mega Drive releases, so I went to eBay and was able to find a seller that had a decent selection of games that I needed, and it would ship to the US. So I grabbed them, picking up titles like Wrestle War, which was supposed to be released in the United States and then canceled, Sensible Soccer, Micro Machines Turbo Tournament 96, and this game, Street Racer. Street Racer from Ubisoft was apparently released on far more consoles than I was aware of. Originally appearing on the Super Nintendo in November of 1994, that apparently wasn't enough for Ubisoft, who would go on to release it for the Mega Drive in Europe in 1995, and then later getting to additional ports for the PlayStation, Saturn, Game Boy, PC, and Amiga, with only the Game Boy and PC versions appearing in the United States. I'm not exactly sure why that is, but it seems like in the United States, Nintendo somehow made Ubisoft agree to release it as a Nintendo exclusive. I wasn't aware of any of this back in the day. I just remember seeing Street Racer on the Super Nintendo and at least appearing to be a B-grade version of Super Mario Kart, complete with screenshots that made it look very similar, both due to the games taking advantage of Mode 7 scaling and rotation. And actually, because of that, I didn't even question Street Racer not being available on the Genesis, because, as Genesis fans were acutely aware, the Genesis simply didn't have the hardware available to display a Mode 7 type game. Or does it? I guess I'll find out shortly in the review, and we'll see how well Ubisoft was able to approximate that effect. But first, a look at the package. And this is Street Racer. This copy's in pretty decent shape, at least on the outside. The outer cover has a few nicks and scratches, mainly near the spine, but no actual holes or tears, so that's nice. And the hang tab is intact at the top, something I always appreciate seeing. One thing to note, and it's minor, but the European Genesis clamshells, or I suppose I should say Mega Drive, are slightly different than the American ones. From just looking at the front, you can't tell, but if you take a look at the black plastic on the inside of the clamshell, you'll notice two things. First, it's smooth. This is something that most European copies I've seen have had, whether it's an earlier release or a later release. In the United States and Japan, this plastic has a textured surface rather than smooth. No idea why that is, as later Master System releases in Europe have had the same clamshells as we got, so go figure. But, however, there is another difference as well. If you look at the front of this release, you can see how it's got Mega Drive in blue on the left side, and that's because when Sega changed the format of the Genesis titles to have Genesis in red on the left, they did the same with Mega Drive titles, except obviously being blue. However, shortly after Sega changed to that format in the United States, they also ditched the clamshells, going to cardboard boxes. Europe, for whatever reason, didn't follow suit, and they continued to use the clamshells, which is why Street Racer is in a clamshell, even though it has a relatively late release date in April of 1995. And one last thing, because I'm sure everyone is bored of this by now, but these late clamshells not only have a smooth plastic surface, but they no longer split in half, with instead having a smaller front portion to the case, and then a larger cartridge portion to make up the difference. Okay, enough about cases. This cover art is definitely interesting, with what appears to be a mishmash of a few different art styles. The art immediately makes me think of the Sega classic arcade kart racer Power Drift that sadly never saw a United States release on any console, and if Street Racer is anywhere near as good as Power Drift, I'll be a very happy camper. At the top, there's an icon indicating that Street Racer supports 4 players, something that Super Mario Kart did not, and something that simply wasn't common until the next console generation. Flipping over to the back, and as is common with PAL releases, there's not much room for flavor text, with having to include room for 6 different languages. And French gets top billing, which I suppose I shouldn't be too surprised about, considering it's an Ubisoft title. The 3 screenshots over to the side are fantastic. They're great quality and they make the game look good. One interesting thing to note is that the 4-player mode, it breaks up the screen horizontally and not into 4 squares. Interesting design choice. Opening up the box, and unfortunately, the manual and cartridge have seen better days, with the manual being subject to some pretty noticeable water damage, but thankfully all the pages and text are fully intact. They're just a little wrinkled. Rather than have the manual have 3 languages per page, it's split up into 6 sections, and honestly I prefer that, it just makes it easier to read. Each language section isn't very long for obvious reasons, but the game is fully explained, and there's screenshots, art, and charts laying out things for the player. Okay, that's the package. Let's get into Street Racer and see just how well it compares to a certain other, more famous, 16-bit karting game. I'm stating the obvious here, but this is clearly a Sega-based channel. And I've grown up being a fan of Sega versus other gaming platforms, namely Nintendo. There's a few reasons for that, but looking back on things, I'm glad of the way things have gone. Because, honestly, and I know I'll get killed for this, but in my opinion, the only really good Nintendo console is the Super Nintendo. The NES is terribly underpowered due to the age of its hardware. The N64 is just simply trash, with a terrible controller to boot. The GameCube's decent, but its use of the incredibly fragile mini DVDs is a problem. And the Wii is, again, an underpowered console, except this time it was a conscious decision. And then the Wii U was a good idea on paper, but like the Wii, it tried to get by on gimmicky controllers versus a solid game library, which is unfortunately small. Now, before you all start in on what about the Switch, let's be real, I consider the Switch a hybrid handheld rather than a full-fledged console, and Nintendo has almost always done well with handhelds, aside from possibly releasing too many variations of said handhelds. Seriously, there's 10 different consoles in the DS line. Without going to Wikipedia, I couldn't tell you which is which. Anyway, I said all that to say this. Even though I'm not a Nintendo fan, there are times when they get it right. And to say they got it right with the Super Nintendo is a huge understatement. Hell, you've got to have a full tower of power with Sega CD and 32X to surpass the color scaling and audio abilities of the Super Nintendo. And along with the hardware that the Super Nintendo packs, it's got some games that are damn near perfect. One of those is the one that started a franchise that's currently on its 8th edition and has included ports to the arcade, and that's Super Mario Kart. The original Super Mario Kart is just a fantastic game, and along with F-Zero was the standard bearer for the Super Nintendo's Mode 7 graphics. Being a Genesis owner at the time, I specifically borrowed a Super Nintendo from some friends just to play games like Super Mario Kart, because I knew there was no way I was ever going to see anything like that on the Genesis. It just didn't have the oomph. Or did it? With Super Mario Kart being the smash hit that it was, developers were out to copy its formula and put out their version of the game.
Ubisoft did this with Street Racer, and in late 1994 I started to see magazine ads for a game that sure looked a whole lot like Super Mario Kart. But it was for the Super Nintendo, and due to its use of Mode 7, I never expected to see anything like that on the Genesis, and Sony was starting to draw me in with the PlayStation about that time as well. Fast forward about 25 years, and I've started on this collection of games for Zilog and Moto, which included PAL-exclusive titles that never made it to America. And lo and behold, what do I see? Well, it appears that Ubisoft released Street Racer for the Mega Drive, completely unbeknownst to me in the mid-90s. But how could such a thing even exist, I thought? It doesn't have the gear to pull off a game like that. I mean, I've seen what happens when Genesis tries to do 3D, like the atrocious Duke Nukem 3D port that I looked at back in episode 111, and it's not pretty. So, when I finally picked up a copy of Street Racer in a bundle a few months ago, I was very curious as to what I was getting. Well, first off, before I actually get to the game, and I promise there is a game review in here, a quick technical aside. Street Racer is designed with PAL consoles in mind, and it's not a game that was designed for NTSC and then just dumped into PAL region. However, if you do want to have a traditional NTSC non-squashed screen experience, you can, as the game plays just fine on a Genesis console without modding. But it does run a little quick, and apparently multiplayer is a bit glitchy due to the resolution difference. I opted just to stick with the original PAL mode, which is the gameplay footage that you're viewing, but you may prefer to see it the other way. Okay, now to the game. After I went into that whole spiel about the Super Nintendo versus the Genesis, you're probably wondering how well the port to the Genesis went. And as you would expect, it's definitely not a one-to-one conversion, as no matter what programming magic used, the Genesis simply doesn't have Mode 7 capabilities. But having said that, Street Racer on the Genesis looks damn good. In fact, I would say it looks much better than I was expecting a kart racer to look on this aging hardware. While it doesn't have the same specific look of a Mode 7 game, the cars and tracks move around in an interesting approximation of it. Also, there's no slowdown or flickering no matter what part of a track you're on, or how many of the other 7 competitors are on the screen. And if you do choose to play the game in NTSC mode, it moves even smoother and faster, but maybe too fast, for reasons I'll get to in a minute. Along with just how well structurally the game engine looks, there's plenty of color as well. Developers Vivid Image managed to squeeze every last bit out of the Genesis limited 64 color on-screen limit, and it makes games like the relatively uninspired port of Star Wars Chess that I looked at last week look even worse in comparison. Okay, so the game looks fantastic. What else? Well, the in-game sound is solid as well. One of the reasons why I went with playing the game in PAL mode is because the soundtrack to the game is definitely above average, and it just didn't sound quite right, slightly sped up in NTSC mode. Had the soundtrack been just meh, I probably wouldn't have cared so much, but the game has a good variety of music, with each of the 8 track locations getting its own song somewhat themed to the area, and then of course the game has other music tracks here as well. Along with the music, the sound effects are pretty nice as well. This isn't one of those titles where all the effort was focused just on one or the other. One thing I particularly enjoyed is the sound of the smack when your character slaps another racer. It just sounds so satisfying. The credit for this goes to Matt Furness, who worked on a ton of games from 1988 to 2001, and that apparently was not by accident. To expand on what one of the other games he worked on was World Trophy Soccer, and during that review back in episode 82, I said, quote, "I think the audio is the best part of the game." So, there you go. So, awesome graphics, check. Solid music and sound, check. What about the gameplay? Well, here's where things start to crash back to earth a bit. In the main game mode, you race against 7 other competitors in a series of 8 tracks, with each of the competitors having a home track for their character. For instance, Surf, a busty blonde from Australia, has a beach-designed track with the Sydney Opera House in the background. And Frank, who's a certain monster that you can probably figure out, hails from Transylvania with a nighttime track that has a sufficiently creepy castle for scenery. The goal is to race through each of the 8 tracks and earn enough points to win the Cup Championship either by placing in a high position or by earning bonus points from collecting stars on the track or having the fastest lap. Complete the Bronze Cup to unlock the Silver Cup, and then so on to unlock the Gold Cup. This should all sound pretty familiar if you've played any of the Mario Karts. However, there's a few problems. The first is, as great as the game looks, all of the players handle terribly, and each level feels like you're driving on ice. Staying on the track for mild turns is fine, but any sharp turn and you're probably going into the weeds. Each of the 8 drivers has stats in 5 different characteristics, but it seemed like they only made marginal differences in gameplay in regards to staying on the track. Along with the general traction issues, the game's rubber band artificial intelligence is poor, and I compare it to the early Need for Speed titles if you're familiar with those. Essentially, if you want to win a race, it oftentimes comes down to more being lucky than good. And this is an easy mode, much less with any of the other difficulties. Case in point, I was racing with Raph, the fastest character in the game, without cheating, and I was in second place. For whatever reason, Surf was able to stay ahead of me even though my kart was floored and she was in a slower vehicle. The only time I was ever able to win a race would be when I would manage to stay close to the leaders and then hit a turbo boost right at the end to get ahead of them for just long enough to cross the finish line. These issues with control and artificial intelligence really bring down what had the markings of a stellar game. Along with the standard cup modes, you can also create your own cup, consisting of any or all of the 24 tracks, and there's also a battle or rumble mode, and Rocket League's great-great-granddaddy in soccer mode. The rumble mode consists of racing around on a circular track and attempting to knock your opponents off the edge of the track into the ether, with the goal being the last kart standing. There's 2 versions, one with a rainbow border that is broken down after being hit, and then the hardcore version with no border, just the track and a whole lot of emptiness. Rumble mode is mildly amusing, but definitely not near as good as the battle mode in Super Mario Kart, and it's probably best suited just to multiplayer. The same can be said for soccer mode as well. I had a bit of fun with this, more so than Rumble mode, and I do like the concept, which, again, if you've played Rocket League, this is essentially a much more primitive 16-bit version. However, the controls are definitely a bit awkward, especially when you have to drive towards yourself rather than the goal. And then there's a bit of the weird rubber band AI here as well, although it's not as bad as what's in race mode. All told, my experience with Street Racer was enjoyable and yet still frustrating. It's an incredibly impressive bit of programming, especially when we mix in the fact that the game supports up to 4 players. However, as I've said many times on the channel, you can have all the elements of an excellent game, but if it doesn't play well, it puts a huge damper on everything. If you're planning on playing Street Racer and only ever playing it in single player mode, it's a 2-star game. But giving this game an overall rating based only on single player mode isn't fair. So as a result, I'm giving it 3 stars, with the understanding that if you really want to get the most out of the game, you'll need a friend or 3. Anyone curious about a karting style game on the Genesis should definitely give it a look.
Okay, that was Street Racer. I've got to be honest, I was hoping for more, but even without it fully hitting my expectations, the graphics are something to be seen for Genesis fans, and the music was a nice surprise as well. Had the control and AI been just a touch better, this could have been an all-time great for the console, especially with the ability to create your own custom cups. Can you imagine if you could create your own series with something like Rock and Roll Racing? I think I just blew my own mind. Anyway, next week on Zilog and Moto, we're staying with Genesis, and it's sports sequel time again, just in time for the beginning of the football season. The original game in the series that I'm looking at was far better than I was expecting it to be, so this one definitely has a high watermark to surpass for that title. I think it can get there though. I've got some faith and some positive memories of playing it 30 years ago, so we'll see if it can live up to the standards set by that first game, and whatever foggy memories I might have floating around. Please remember to subscribe if you like this video, and remember, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later!